I'm from the Chodong Karmo translation group located in Tinchuli, Boda, Kathmandu, Nepal. And I want to say that I'm extremely grateful for the Tsadra Foundation, first of all, for allowing me to be in this position, because without the support of this foundation, I wouldn't be able to be here right now. And of course, to everybody coming. And also the idea of not only bringing practitioners and scholars together, but also the experienced generation of practitioners and scholars and the younger generation. I think that's actually crucial and probably should happen even more. But it's a great beginning. And I wanted to mention one thing, a personal thing. I think that for all of us, the thing that we are concerned with here is really our dream and the realization of our dream. And the first night I told a few friends this. The first night here, I had a dream about something, a very similar setting, and I was also speaking in front of others, and I was intoning a Brazilian song. And since now I have a microphone, and I'm very close to realizing this dream of mine, but I think it would be a nightmare for all of you. So I won't do that, but I'll introduce the speakers for this afternoon's panel. I'll introduce all 5 speakers first, and then just address the questions. Ask them to address the questions which we worked out before this conference, and then basically I'll be out of the way. So the first speaker this afternoon will be Karl Brunnhölzl. He's a Tsadra fellow, one of the two Tsadra fellows here on this panel. And he works for the Nitarte Translation Network and is involved a lot with the Nalanda Bodhi Institute, which are both under Dzogchen Pönlo Rinpoche. Karl is initially trained as a physician and studied Tibetology and Sanskrit at the University of Hamburg in Germany, and later studied Buddhist philosophy and Tibetan language at the Marpa Institute for Translators in Kathmandu, Nepal, under the direction of Khenpo Tsultrim Gyatso Rinpoche. And he's very busy. I'm sure all of you have seen the little books he's published so far, and so many of them. And also he teaches a lot all over the world, so I'm really, really happy to be sitting next to him. The second speaker will be Willa Miller, who arrived finally. She's founder and spiritual director of the Natural Dharma Fellowship in Boston. And she's a visiting lecturer on Buddhist ministry at Harvard University, at the Divinity School of the Harvard University. And she's been an interpreter, oral interpreter and translator for many, many years. And her work has been focused on mainly liturgical and exegetical literature. And she completed 2 3-year retreats under Karl Rinpoche. And the third speaker, so then we move to the other side, will be Richard Barron. Translator's name Chökyi Nyima. Not yet Rinpoche, but maybe. He also served for as an interpreter for many lamas of 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism, including his first teacher, who was Karl Rinpoche, under whom he also completed a 3-year retreat. And he later became a disciple of Chagdu Tulku Rinpoche, and probably through that inspiration got involved in a long-term translation project of the 7 treasuries of Longchenpa. And he published for Padma Publishing and is the second Tsadra fellow on this panel. The third speaker is Larry Mermelstein from the Nalanda Translation Committee. Since 1971, Larry was a close student of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who in his own right was, I think, extraordinary teacher in that he was also directly involved in translation work. So hopefully Larry will have something to say about that. And he was also authorized to be a senior teacher in this tradition, Acharya, by the son of Trungpa Rinpoche, Sakyong Mipam Rinpoche. He is the executive director of the Nalanda Translation Committee since 1978, and worked also as an editor for Shambhala publication, and is also closely involved with the Naropa University, as a founding administrator and also language teacher. And the last speaker on this panel will be Alex Berzin, who is the director and founder of the Berzin Archives, this incredible resource I'm sure all use a lot, which is expanding, I think, every day probably, and is currently has 21 language sections, 6 of which are from the Islamic world, which I find particularly amazing. Also because I was in Dharamsala recently and I met one of his Arabic translators, which was fascinating. Alex got his PhD at Harvard University and in Sanskrit and Indian studies, and later moved to India, where he lived for 29 years, mainly involved with work with the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala. And he studied with also equally, like others here, with masters from the 4 Buddhist schools of Tibetan Buddhism, was an interpreter of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and mainly for, as Alex mentioned this morning, Tsenchab Serkong Rinpoche for 9 years, with whom he had a very close relationship. Alex has published 17 books, so he's also an incredibly published author and a very, very busy lecturer on Tibetan Buddhism in his home Berlin, but also all over the place. He's traveling a lot to Russia and I think to many, many places. So with this, that's the short introduction for all 5 speakers. First, Karl will speak on translation, transmission, the role of academia and tradition. And so I have 2 questions, which probably Karl will answer in one go. The first of these would be, what elements should a modern translation include? Contextualization and supplementary material and so on. And what are the academic skills which are important for a qualified translator, and how important are traditional elements of transmission in this process? Yes.
Thank you. And also thanks to Tsadra Foundation, making it possible for all us to be here. And in particular, I'm very happy that increasing number of people from academia and so-called practitioners come together. And I will say more later about that distinction or the lack thereof, because I myself feel like a weird hybrid of these 2 worlds. So I'm very happy that they seem to come together more closely, sometimes at least. So thanks for making that possible. So I'm going to start with, as you see, that first question. And I'm not going to bore you with all, just lists of things. That's why I have them on the screen here, so you can read them. I'm not going to rattle it off. But you could see that I think there's 2 main elements, and that ties into the second question of translation, modern translation. There's formal elements, and then there's technical skill elements. So I divided my presentation into these 2. And of course, there's much interrelation between these 2, but you could see like those 10 thingies there under formal elements. So those, you could say this is like the 10 boomies of a translation. And of course, most of them are very obvious, some of them maybe not. So you could say that's the full path if you want to go completely ballistic in terms of not just translating, but doing all kinds of other things, supplementary materials and so on and so forth. And of course, this depends on the genre. So I'm not saying that every translation should have these 10, obviously. But if it's a more technical text, then it might be good. If it's poetry, you can drop most of those. And if it's a sadhana, you can probably drop all of them. So it depends, obviously, on the genre. But when we talk about the elements of a modern translation, like which elements should a modern translation have, that begs at least 2 further questions. First one, translation of what and translation for whom? So the question doesn't really make sense unless you take these 2 into consideration. And that opens up a whole can of worms, obviously. So the first one, of what? So this means which genre are you translating? And that also determines, as I said, the number of formal elements or the extent of formal elements that are desirable. But then, of course, there's no agreement here among anybody how many of these formal elements actually a translation should have or not. So some people don't want to use footnotes. Other people are completely wild about footnotes, like me, and so on. But so it's very different what we need in terms of supplementary materials when we translate a philosophical text versus a sadhana or like a triik or poetry and so on and so forth. So the formal elements, in brief, depend on the genre. So you could have a maximum, like these 10, or you could have any number fewer than those. Then the second question, for whom? And that has 2 subpoints. You see I'm following Tibetan tradition here. The second point has 2 subpoints, which is for whom. So for whom means, first of all, the setting. If you're translating in an academic setting, then there's pretty clear rules about how you're supposed to translate and what formal elements should be included in your translation. Whereas outside of academia, there's actually no agreement at all about anything. So you find all kinds of, how do you say, ecological little niches, biotopes of translation and supplementary materials. But it seems that it's changing now because there's like, the 84,000. They are pretty clear guidelines for translators, editorial policies and things like that. And I think also in the Library of Tibetan Classics. So it seems there's some improvement. And then the second part of that is the audience. So there's the setting within which you translate. And then there's the audience. And that's, as a lot of people already have said, that's of course impossible to please everybody or even to reach everybody. Like there's no translation that is suitable for everybody. So I think therefore it's good at the beginning to have at least some idea what one's audience is. And ideally actually make that clear in the book, like right up front. So there's no lawsuits later. And when we talk about audiences, then again, we can make this very general distinction between academia and practitioners, but I think that's kind of getting more and more blurry these days. And but then even within practitioners, so-called practitioners, you have many different levels. Like you have people who walk in off the street, you have very experienced practitioners, you have people who are more interested in philosophical stuff, people who are interested in just practicing, and so on and so forth. And people have very different interests too. So the audiences are as many as the translators, or more actually. So then I think in terms of this distinction between academia and practitioner, at least from my personal experience, I like to use the best of both worlds as far as I can to my abilities. And of course that's sometimes a little bit conflicting, difficult. But I try to use what I find useful to actually enable the reader to get a better understanding of what I'm translating. And that means also that the separation between academia and practitioner is a rather modern Western concept. It did not really exist in India or Tibet that much. Like when you look at all the famous Indian and Tibetan authors, they all have been scholars and practitioners. There was no question about that. It was not even an issue. So that means for a traditional Indian or Tibetan great master, it would be absurd to separate the two, like being scholar and practitioner. And I think from what I can see, at least to some extent, and for some people, not all of them obviously, there's a movement towards that to bring those two together, and in the sense of using both areas to the maximum, to the best, to the most benefit for the reader. And in that vein, then, I think it is a great kindness to the reader to use supplementary material, actually as much as we can. So to bring the reader to a point where they can actually appreciate what is translated. As you all know, and I think that's actually maybe even the most important part of the transmission of a written translation. Because Tibetan texts and Indian texts tend to be rather complicated, not easy to understand, and they require a lot of background knowledge, which, let's say, the average, even Buddhist reader often doesn't have, or has a hard time acquiring. So, and I think it's really the job of the translator to at least bridge that gap to some extent, to kind of bring the people up to speed, so to speak, to at least get to a level where they can more fully understand what is said here. And as you all know, Tibetan and Indian texts were written by specialists for other specialists. They were not written for a general audience because there was no such thing. So imagine, in this day and age, all the literature we would have would only be scientific journals. Like no newspapers, no school books, no documentaries, nothing. Then how would anybody who is not a specialist then have access to those journals? What's in there? It's very difficult. So you have to provide some bridge to actually even be able to deal with that. The other problem, I think, is that a lot of people in the West have the idea, yeah, just pick up a book, any book, and I will understand it, right? But in the Buddhist tradition, nobody would think that, ever. So that's other problematic issue here. And that means, again, we need supplementary material to help people to actually understand, because if we don't do that, just the translation alone will not be sufficient in my eyes, because then people probably will just drop it after 2 words or 2 pages. Depending on its translation, obviously, and the material, but still, it's very hard to read without some introduction. So, of course, then what we can do as a translator to provide supplementary materials is not a full transmission. It's not, I'm not saying we should assume the role of the guru or the teacher or somebody like that, but we should, I think, supply as much information, correct information, qualified information, that enables the reader to really appreciate what is translated, to bring to life what we translate, and to actually make it more meaningful in this day and age. So in other words, supplementary materials, I think, is important for people to receive the most benefit out of the translation. So, and of course, in addition to that, there's still more guidance needed, depending on the text. Like, you still might need an empowerment, or more explanation, practice instructions, things like that. But I think a lot can be done to bring people onto the same page, or at least a few pages before, so they can actually fully participate in a subsequent teaching. Okay, 2 minutes. So can you scroll down, Steve, please, a little bit? So as you can see, or not, when it's scrolled down, it's hard because the screen is small. That's too far. Okay, now, yeah, go down. Yeah, I was hoping there would be more space on the screen, but anyway. So I'm not going through all those elements, or the formal elements, but in each one, I think there's a lot of things that you can do, like the things that you can do in an introduction, the things that you can do in footnotes, the things that you can do in an appendix, in a glossary, and so on and so forth. All of these have their own place and their own function on those 10 Vumi, on this 10 Vumi pattern here. And obviously, yeah, it's not going to work with the reading, but never mind. So I'm coming to the second point then, which is the technical skills. And in terms of the technical skills, I think when I can approach it from an academic point of view, there are certain academic skill sets, such as knowledge of, for example, not just Tibetan, but also like Sanskrit, Pali, Chinese, whatever. And other things, such as, for example, general studies of, history of Buddhism, different schools from a more academic perspective, and also presenting diversity of different academic positions on certain things, and also consult academic specialists on certain issues. And of course, such things as critical apparatus, how much you want to use of that or not. And again, all of this is, just possibilities. I'm not saying everybody should do that, or this is like a standard or anything like that. It depends obviously on the different translator and the audience and the genre. And from a traditional point of view, then of course there's a few important things, like such as being really familiar with the specific technical terms in different genres and their use in different contexts, being familiar with the Mahavyutpati, Tsadra Bambunipa, and things like that. And also, of course, ideally having studied a text with a qualified teacher before you translate it, though that seems to be almost the exception these days, but it would be very desirable to do so. And then in terms of practice texts, of course, it would be very desirable to be a practitioner in general, and ideally a practitioner of that particular practice that one is translating. And as was said before, in terms of Vajrayana, Tantric translations, Mahamudra, Dzogchen, and so on and so forth, one obviously needs the Long Wang tree. And also, one should be able, I guess, to consult with native speakers and learned masters in Tibetan, ideally to ask one's questions and hopefully receive answers. So last but not least, apart from just academic or traditional, then there's a few general skills a translator should have, or it would be good to have, such as, writing skills. Yeah, you're laughing, but, in this day and age, if you look at the universities, the main complaint of professors is that people have no idea how to express themselves in writing. Then, of course, if needed and possible, poetical skills for certain translations. And then I think a whole different level, which I'm not going to go into, but I'm just going to raise this issue, is being a cultural translator, what I call a cultural translator, because you're not only translating words, you're also translating, and this came up in another panel, you're also translating completely different cultures and concepts about everything, like how to look at the world. Like certain terms do not even exist in the other language. So you have to explain what that is, and then, like give a brief history of psychology when you ask a question, that kind of thing. So obviously this was very brief, and if you want to have more details, then I guess you have to wait for the publication online of more details on the 10 bhumis, because they don't fit on the screen. So I think I end here.
Thank you very much.
And thank you.
We have a few minutes if the other panelists would like to comment or add something to what Karl had to say.
The paradigm that you explained is the paradigm of a book, but there's also the paradigm now of putting translations online. And when we put our translations online, then this opens up a whole vista of tools that we can provide the reader, like we try to do on the Berzin archives. So you can have, you put your cursor over a technical term, and you get a pop-up window with the definition. This helps very much for the reader to be able to understand. If there are passages that are difficult to understand, you can have links to other articles and so on that will explain them. If you feel that the reader needs to have some background material before reading your text, you can, again, give a link to an article or an introduction or something like that, which if somebody needs this background, they can look to that as well. We have suggested other articles and other translations of similar content so that you can do online as well. On an online publication of a translation, you can have a search engine, and the search can go through that thing. Also, if you tag it very well, then what we're planning is in the next version of the website is interactive, so that people have their own pages. You can then select the type of tags of various other type of material that you would like to have available for yourself, for your own study or practice process. You'd be able to highlight various passages that you find very inspiring or very helpful, put it onto your own page so that you can have that for study. So when we turn to the internet as the paradigm for publishing our translations, then becomes a whole nother ballgame.
Thank you.
Karl, I was interested, you brought up the idea of poetical skills when translating verse, and that's been touched on before, but I wanted to touch on it with a slightly heavier hand here and say, well, from personal experience, I've translated a lot of liturgical material, which is almost always in verse, and initially all I was trying to do was get the meaning across as best as I felt I could, with no idea that people were going to actually be using the English as a liturgical language. And so as soon as things shifted in the communities that I was working for and people began to use more English, I started getting all kinds of feedback that it
Yes,
was,
I know what you mean.
it was impossible to recite aloud. And I make no claim whatsoever to have any poetical skills. So I was interested that you brought that up, because as translators we work so much with material in verse, metered verse, that coming up with some, I mean, free verse is a possibility, and that's what I opt for because I have personally no choice, given my lack of skill in anything else. But something that I think is something we can hope to work towards is the ability to actually versify things, because there's a reason Tibetans put it into verse. You can actually carry a tune with it. You know, you can actually chant. It's easier to memorize, for one thing. And the attempts that I've seen in English, as brave and as competent as they are, I always wonder how much meaning has to be sacrificed in order to make it fit. You have this kind of Procrustean approach where to get it to fit the iambic pentameter or whatever form you're working in, a certain amount of the jam-packed meaning of the Tibetan line has to be sacrificed. So for me, it's always been a question of don't sacrifice the meaning in any way. Even if you could, you wouldn't be able to do it. So just don't sacrifice the meaning. Just do free verse. But I'm interested in any feedback anybody has about that.
Well, you could also, for example, you know, use 2 English lines for 1 Tibetan or Sanskrit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, then you have more space, and then it comes nicer.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you have to tell that, you know.
Yeah, explain that's what you're doing, but sure.
And also, of course, if you do like, you know, Sadhana or something and it's really long, then you have, it's already like 50 pages and you do double lines, then there's a problem there. But that's something one can consider.
I think I would like to ask Willa to speak next, so we have time for our speakers. And also I think because Willa will touch a little bit on this subject. So Willa's questions were the role of the text in transmission, and does a translator have a responsibility to consider the aesthetic experience evoked by a text as a factor in transmission of the meaning?
Thank you. I'm going to kind of take up where Karl was leaving off with this question of how do we prepare ourselves as translators, considering that our material is going to be used in transmission, if we think of transmission as a communication of meanings, maybe from one generation to the next or from one individual to another. And in thinking about this, actually Karl outlined a whole lot of all these different ways we can prepare, and I wanted to bring up 2 other ways. And one is the way of practice, the importance of having some basis in a practice that is connected to the text that we are translating. And I think many people in this room have probably had the experience of translating a text that you yourself have practiced, or you are, say, translating a commentary on a practice that you do, and that experience can be so fulfilling, like you're hearing from a best friend, or you're hearing from somebody close to you, that kind of intimacy with the text. Or probably we've all been in this position too, encountering a text and for some reason needing to read or translate it when we haven't had that connection with practice. And that can be really challenging and sometimes anxiety-producing. So just wanted to bring up that first one. And another way that we can engage in a kind of self-cultivation as translators, or non-self-cultivation, excuse me, is to reflect a bit on what we're, you can put up the first slide, on what we are doing, as translators, what we're actually doing, what is our lojong as translators, what is our mental process of reflection. And in my own case, I came to translation through practice. I'm just putting that up there in case what I'm saying is boring and you can read E. Cummings' wonderful poem, Since Feeling is First, which is, actually I'm going to be talking sort of to that, in that direction. To reflect on, so what we're doing, lojong. And so in my own case, I came through into translation through the door of practice initially, Buddhist practice, and then I ended up somehow in grad school. I guess you might call that practitioner drift, which I think we're familiar with, some of us. And in that process, I did encounter some really interesting reflections from Western philosophy and also from literary theory on what meaning means. And so in my own case, the one of my practices of lojong, or my own preparation as a translator, has been to reflect a little bit on what meaning means. So we've been talking a lot this weekend about meaning. That word has come up so often in the last few panel discussions and in the speakers' addresses, and I think when we think about meaning, at least me initially, when I think about it, I'm thinking about something cognitive, that we're taking a word and we're going to capture its meaning. And so to give an example, we've all been through this process where we are searching for the right words to translate something like Zangtal, and we decide it's total openness, and then we're like, no, it's unconfined capacity, and we're, whatever, we're struggling between these different meanings, and then maybe we consult with our Kempo in the basement, Sarah Harding wishes there were, I think we all do, or whoever and we finally decide, oh, it's total openness, right? And along with that, so we may think, okay, I've captured the meaning, I've got it in my hand. And with that, often, we have this feeling of pleasure, of the joy, the delight of having landed on something that feels right, feels like it has captured the meaning of the text. Now, we might say that's a cognitive process. It's a cognitive meaning. We have taken something and we've rendered it in a cognitive equivalent in English. But I also want to point out that there was an experience of delight and pleasure that went with that. And my question is that part of the meaning? And that was an experience in our body and in our heart. So I wanted to just problematize this idea of what meaning is. And so I came up with just thinking of some qualities of meaning that I've been exposed to in the context of being in graduate school, being in these classes, different classes on theory. And so you can go to the next slide. The first, so just some alternate understandings of meaning that we might be able to draw on, or I have certainly. I'm just really sharing my own process for translation reflection, our lojong, our preparation as translators. And the first is that meaning is carried in gaps, or in the gaps. Meaning is not content alone. So that idea, to some extent, was made well known in academia by Derrida. This idea that there are silences within language, and that kind of sounds maybe conceptual or heady, but think about it. when we're translating something, haven't you read a text before, like where you notice, isn't it interesting what he isn't saying? Like, and that can tell us a lot, actually, about what he's trying to say. He's avoiding certain terms, maybe terms that were used a lot in his day. So I'm just giving an example, whoever he is, the author. So this question of meaning carried in silences or in gaps. You can go to the next slide. And the second idea that has been helpful for me in translating is thinking about meaning as contingent, as a dependent, meaning as dependent on everything that's around it, contextualizing things. And sometimes, we may think, well, of course I contextualize, right? I know this word means what it means because of what's around it, so we contextualize it. But sometimes it's not so obvious how it's contingent. So I'll give an example, and I put 3 ways meaning is contingent there, but I think we could think of 100 ways. But meaning is contingent on intertextuality. Sometimes texts are talking to each other, even when it isn't really obvious. But you might find that out by figuring out who's written at the same time. And meaning is contingent on culture. I think that's one that we're somewhat familiar with. And meaning is contingent on time. That is, that meanings evolve. And that we may say, oh, yes, of course we know that. But in fact, actually, I think we don't always, or at least I can speak for myself. I haven't always known that's the case. And sometimes so for my dissertation, I worked on Yangompa. And one of the key terms that I was working with was how Yangompa understands this term ngoponeluk, which is actually quite hard to translate, ngoponeluk. And I discovered in going back and reading, finding that term in Mahayana sources and in other early tantric sources and then in Tibetan materials, that meaning had changed and evolved a lot over time. And what Yangompa meant by it is not necessarily what an early sutra had meant by it. So this idea of contingency. And you can go to the next one. The third is that meaning is experiential. That is, meaning is always experienced. It's not just understood. And that is to say that meaning is evocative of experience. It's evocative of experience. And I just put a quote from Roland Barthes up there because that's something that he wrote about a lot in, for example, in his book, The Pleasure of the Text, that there is an experience that goes along with reading, or in our case, sometimes listening or practicing with a text, and that experience is a form of meaning. And especially, I think we even find this, of course, in the Tibetan context, in instructional texts, where language is used to evoke or invoke particular experiences and realizations. And there may be no translation for some of those words that are trying to evoke an experience. So there's actually this category of words, nyamnyong gitsik, that are words that are just intended to invoke an experience, like hedewa or rigewa, or many of us familiar with this pe in Chu, right? There's no meaning. We could say we can't translate pe, but it is used to invoke this experience. And the fourth is that meaning is embodied. Meaning is embodied. And for this one, I actually want to read Mark Johnson's quote here. So a number of philosophers are now thinking about this and actually drawing from neuroscience to think about what meaning actually is in human experience. So he says, meaning is embodied. It arises through embodied organism-environment interactions in which significant patterns are marked within the flow of experience. Meaning involves the blending of the conceptual, structural, and formal dimension on the one hand, and the preconceptual, non-formal, felt dimensions on the other. Meaning resides in neither of these dimensions of experience alone, but only in their ongoing connectedness and interanimation. So I think this has come up already today in Janet Gyatso's talk, this idea of meaning being an embodied experience, and also Anne Klein's discussion of wisdom as being present in the body, finding that in Tibetan texts. So to say that language is experienced not only by a cognitive mind, but also by the nervous system, the feelings, and the emotions, means that language and our translations are felt as much as they are understood. And so having that in our background when we're translating, I think can make a big difference to the experience of someone who's receiving, say, our text in English as a form of Dharma transmission. And are we done? Okay, all right. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Now we just have 1 or 2 minutes if there's any remarks.
Question for Willa. What do you do when you encounter these very onomatopoetic poetic terms like hadewa and singewa and these things? Have you found a way to try to make some experiential feeling in the target language in addition to, finding some meaning?
Well, I have found that if I have pressed my teacher, or if I'm translating on those terms, they will come up with a description, and sometimes, like with those terms, you can come up with a translation like brilliant awakeness for Hurigewa or something. But in my own case, I've put in parentheses in the Tibetan, just transliterated, because it doesn't seem like it seems like the sound, that part of it is the sound.
You haven't
evoking
tried
the experience.
You haven't tried to create some analogy in English that would be like some, I don't know,
Like, wow.
exclamation. Yeah,
Ooh la la.
wow.
Oh.
Far out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I like the idea.
I came up with an experiment because I was a little bit, I must admit, if you would go to Tibetan teachers and they say, oh, din yamgi keche, there's no way you're going to translate. That's just like expressing some experience. And I thought, well, okay, we can do that. English is no slouch at expressing things. So one of the things I've tried, and, this is just throwing it out there, is you can do something like, for example, a lot of the words, you end up thinking that a word like vivid would work in a lot of those cases, but you can't use vivid all the time. So like you say, you use the brilliant, vivid, but you could do something like vivid, so vivid, something like that. You get a kind of exhortation feel to it in English that can capture some of the flavor, I think. And the problem with phoneticizing is that nobody's system works. The phonetic, unless you do a really straightforward. Problem with most phonetic systems I've seen is that they're wonderful, except they don't work. Because you put them in front of the average English reader who has no Tibetan knowledge, and they mispronounce them. So if you could get a phonetic system that would work, that's another possibility. But that really limits your audience. It's the people who are willing to go along with a text that's full of words they don't understand, but can just pronounce because they know how to spell them out.
And it's not a meaningful interjection for most of us. Yeah.
Although Emaho is becoming English.
Yeah, that's coming in.
Thank you. I would like to stay with you, if possible, as the next speaker. Staying with words, actually. So that was the question that you agreed on. Is there the right one on the advisability of multiple translations in the target language for single source language terms and the use of word lists and concordances? That would be the first topic. And the second one, tailoring translations for future generations of teachers who might not know Tibetan, of future lineage holders, possibly.
Well, just to start with, I was thinking back to the Boulder conference in 2008 that many people have referred to, and I remember being asked to participate in a short, almost ritual, a short ceremony in which I had to say something. And so I remember thanking Light of Berzin, thanking Lama Chunam and Sangjay and Jules and Jesse for what I called chivying me out of my burrow and getting me to kind of come out a bit in public and interact with people more, because I tend to be quite a hermit. And 6 years later, I still don't get out all that much. But I would like to thank Eric and Drupchu and Christian, everybody associated with Tsadra and all the sponsoring organizations for once again chivying me out of my burrow and bringing me out, blinking into the sunlight to actually interact with people involved in much the same work that I do. Because I think one of the real important messages I've felt at this conference is that I'm involved in something much bigger than myself. And in a certain sense, we're all involved in something much bigger than all of us. And so that's been an important point for me, an important part of this conference. So again, thank you very much for making this possible. I'm going to again acknowledge the impact that David Bellos's talk had on me. It's quite interesting that the one person who's been referred to most during this conference is the one who has nothing to do with our particular field, except translation, but not translation of Dharma. And it occurred to me that there's maybe some value in occasionally thinking of ourselves first and foremost as translators, rather than translators of something. You know, maybe if I was a better Buddhist, I would say, well, no, first and foremost, it's for the Dharma and it's for all beings. But there might be some practical use to thinking of ourselves as first and foremost translators, period, involved in that particular process of bringing what David referred to as, you know, I love that image of the translation up and translation down and so forth. Although I must admit, for me personally, and this brings me to my topic, I am getting there. My feeling in working with Tibetan is the relationship between the two languages I'm working in, the source language that is not my native language and the target language that is my native language, is more like one of mutual deference. Not thinking in terms of dominant and lesser, although I'm not claiming to be using Dr. Bellos's model properly. I'm just saying my own experience is the sense of, reminds me very much of an experience I'm sure almost all of us, if not all of us, have had, of going to a ceremony in a Tibetan context, and you show up at the right time, and it starts 20 minutes late because the lamas are all busy trying to seat each other. And, you know, oh, man, you know, and there's like this back and forth where the lamas are trying to decide who sits higher than the other, and nobody wants to take the higher seat. So it's kind of like, for me, Tibetan and English are always kind of speaking to each other to try and figure out the best way for the transmission, if you will, sorry to use that loaded word in this context, but the passage from one language to another to take place. And that brings me to my topic of how useful I found to free myself of the sense that I always had to use more or less the same English for the same Tibetan word. Because I would go to teachers and I would say, well, here's this word in this context, and here's this word in this context. It's the same word, but it doesn't seem to be saying the same thing. And they'd say, of course it's not saying the same thing. To them it was obvious. And I would say, how do you know? And they'd say, context. Look at the context. Everything is context. So it gave me a sense of freedom that I could take a single word and interpret it into English in different ways to suit the context. And it was enormously freeing for me to give myself that latitude. To say, well, I mean, I still keep a word list of my choices, my favorite choices, but there are multiple entries in the English column for each single entry in the Tibetan column now, whereas there used to be one. And so it's just something I thought I would bring up. And I may be preaching to the converted. It may be something that everybody's quite comfortable with, but it took me a while to get comfortable with that, of feeling that I could still be completely, again a loaded word, authentic to what I felt the source text to be saying, and yet use multiple versions in English, because it seems to me, while we can argue that English has a far richer vocabulary than Tibetan, Tibetans were able to accomplish the nuance in context that English really needs to rely on bigger vocabulary to manage, to get across. And so I think we should exploit that to the fullest. I'm a big fan of adjectives, you know, of qualifying adjectives. I get heat for it, but I am a big fan of them because you can attain your shades of nuance. I remember somebody mentioned Ken MacLeod earlier when we were all part of Karl Rinpoche Center in Vancouver back in the day. He was called upon to translate at a public talk by a great Sakya master, Dejang Rinpoche. And at one point, Ken paused before he translated and said to the audience, "Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me, as a translator, I'm having some difficulty. Whereas in English, we only have one word for mind, Tibetan has 6, and Rinpoche just used all 6 in one sentence." So there's an example of the opposite of what I'm talking about, a richer vocabulary for mind, perhaps, than English. But I think English attains its richness because of all this nuance that we can get a hold of, we can express through the use of adjectives and multiple translations and so forth. So that was one point I just wanted to bring up of personally the kind of liberating, again another really loaded word, liberating effect that it had on myself when I gave myself the freedom. I've loosened my chain a little bit and allowed myself to explore other ways of using English to express a single term in Tibetan. So the other thing I wanted to address is, it's already been brought up, so it's kind of stole my thunder a little bit, but I'll thunder on a bit at perhaps lesser volume. And that's the idea of this traditional models such as Wanglong and Tri. And again, we've heard this, in fact, it just came up a moment ago. Given that there are models in the tradition that we're translating into our milieu, given that there are models that were considered at least the baseline, at least the kind of lowest common denominator for there to be some effective transmission, there's going to, it seems to me, have to be some attention paid to working out what the model is in the West. We may just copy the old model, I don't know, but we need to have some sense of a template for what constitutes a complete transmission in any given context. And this doesn't bring up any sense of the machi flying out the window and so forth, of there being the transmission in the authentic sense. Okay, we all hope for that, but there has to be at least the baseline authenticity of some transmission taking place. And I think that's going to be a real issue in the West because we're so used to getting our information from books or videos or whatever. We're used to getting our information from something other than a living source sitting in front of you, going through it with you. School and college notwithstanding, you actually sit in front of a professor. But the way we tend to work with information a lot of the time is on the printed page or on the internet or whatever. And it seems to me that we have to kind of bring into play a discussion of what kind of model do we need to think about adopting in the West for there to be authentic in the purely basic sense of the word. Again, I'm not talking about anything highfalutin here, just the kind of sense of, yeah, somebody's had effective transmission for there to be continuity generation after generation, because we're already in a situation where there are perfectly qualified, authentic in that sense, perfectly qualified teachers who've been given the robe and the bowl by their Tibetan teachers. They've been given permission to go and teach, and they're teaching, and they don't know a word of Tibetan. And what we're contributing to, obviously, is a corpus of literature in our respective Western languages that they're going to be using as tools. And so, to that extent, as translators, we're very much part of that process. And I've personally always tended to kind of shy away from accepting the responsibility that I have anything to do with the teaching process. I just translate, just set me off in the corner with my laptop and I'll translate. But, it's kind of time to step up to the plate because I'm running out of excuses. We're part of that process. We are, in a sense, teachers because we're creating the body of information that future teachers are going to use as a basis for whatever will constitute authentic and effective communication and transmission in Western culture. So I didn't have too much more to say. I'm kind of the lightweight on the panel here. But I did want to bring up something that happened in, do I have time for this, or 1 second? Seriously?
Please go ahead.
Okay, it's quite short. Boy, it's funny how fast 5 or 8 minutes can go. Chögyam Rinpoche was about to begin a long series of teachings over 2 weeks, I think, or something, and many, many people come to these teachings, and there was a lot of excitement building in the air about, because it was a special event. Even he was, you know, this is a really special event kind of thing. And he began by saying to everybody, through me as the interpreter, he said, "You're probably all wondering what you're going to get by coming to this seminar, this set of teachings." And he said, "It's not about you. You're not the important one. So think of it this way. You're contributing to the continuation of a lineage that will be of benefit to generations so far in the future you can't even imagine, and you're never going to meet them. But because you're here today, that can happen." So it put it in a context. At first everybody was shocked. You know what? I don't matter? You know, it's not about you. But the point he was making was there's this long-range vision of what we're all contributing to. So being part of this conference has made a world of difference for me in terms of reinvigorating that sense of being part of something bigger than myself. So thank you all for that.
Perfect.
Was it worth going over?
Any remarks, please?
What you mentioned raises a very important point, which I think it would be helpful if we devoted some period of time, sometime during this conference too, which is the whole issue that just as lungs of text translations were given from Sanskrit to the Tibetan translators, and then the Tibetan translators started giving lungs of their own translations, we are now at the cusp at which our translations are going to be the basis for lung and oral transmission in the future. And how do we prepare for that? What do you do when somebody asks you to give a lung of your translation and you feel ridiculous? That, you know, how could I possibly give a lung of it? But nevertheless, the tradition has to begin. And also, you might not feel confident that your translation is a particularly accurate translation and or a particularly good translation, and you want to be that to be the basis for the lung. So, and then there are multiple translations by many different translators of the same text. Which one is going to be the one that has the lung that goes on? So this is, I think, a very, very serious question that requires quite a bit of discussion, not just 2 minutes.
Well, we're doing it, and we've been doing it for decades in our community, somewhat choicelessly. And we've been giving lungs, knowing full well that they may not be perfect. We know they're not. And as we find mistakes, we correct them. So somebody later gets a slightly different lung.
Is there kind of like a lung patch, you know, like...
Well, you know,
you got the old lung, but it's okay because we got the patch now.
We affectionately have talked about the old translation school and the new translation school. We are the retranslation school. We want to continue to improve what we've done and because I'm sitting here realizing I really did not prepare very well because I actually am a product of the process that we are all engaged in. I do not practice in Tibetan. I have a little bit, but not much, because I wouldn't really understand what I'm saying well enough to connect the words and the meaning at the same moment. And so I am a product, as most of the Shambhala community, of practicing in English, and there are people also practicing in French and German and Dutch and other languages. And so we have been working with this, and we're trying to be intelligent about it and sensitive to, like, at least the translators are very keenly aware of these issues. The community generally doesn't think about this. It's just happening for them.
But I appreciate very much what you're saying, Alex, because it's something we have to give a lot of thought to beforehand, not in hindsight. We don't want the oops factor to come in where, down the road we go, oops, we should have thinking about that. So I very good point that you raised that it's not something we just mention and
light
pass
point.
on.
Also, I could mention that the internet is a fantastic, I'm very born-again internet person, but with an internet you can get feedback on your translations, you can have surveys, you can do all sorts of user analysis and so on, and invite, suggestions. Does this work? Does this not work? Also in terms of poetics, I was thinking, fantastic, why don't you invite, your readers to, here's my translation, I suck at putting it into verse, can you suggest? And then you get an interactive thing, because I think that the whole future is interactive. That's where it's going. So we need to get in tune with what's happening in the younger generation, because that's what's going to be. Not just old stodgy books, you just put up on a shelf. And you buy, but you never look at.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I think many people still love to open the books, in fact.
Well, a lot of people are collectors,
Yeah, also. Okay, so let's maybe move on to the fourth speaker, Larry. Again, two questions formulated for you. Specifically, what roles do translators play in the transmission of the Vajrayana to new cultures? That would be the first one. And the second, what are the dangers we face in this process, and what is at stake?
I too want to thank Eric, my dear friend Drupju, all of the Tsadra people for making this happen, continuing the Light of Berzin translation conference that we had. This is so important and fun, though it's an immense amount of information, and I don't know if anyone yet has reached burnout 4 or 5 times yet. It's a phenomenal experience to be with old friends I haven't seen in many years, new people I've admired for years and never met, and the commitment, as Bob talked last night, about really more than modeling. We are now supporting translation, long-term practice. This is so important and moving. So thank you so much for bringing us together. Several of my friends have encouraged me to talk more personally, because I like to tell stories. And I feel a little bit like Chuchi just said earlier, I'm another lightweight here. I'm not an academic at all. So I thought just to say a little bit about how I came to this, very, very haphazardly, and a couple little inspiring moments before I deal with the questions. Fortunately, my questions have pretty much been answered by so many other people. Not by me. I had something maybe to say.
Off the hook.
No, not yet. Not yet. But like some of us who are in the 60s, we were kind of interested in Eastern things, and I was a Hindu practitioner of some sort, and thought that I was taught that Sanskrit was some really special language that you could learn, like how things really were put together and some universal cosmic something. It was a rather dreamy idea, I realized. But I was very bored. My math and science thing didn't work out. Everybody was so much smarter than me. I didn't know what to do, but I wasn't quite adventurous enough to drop out. So I looked for something to do. I thought, well, maybe I should learn Sanskrit, or try. And so I went to the professor, Alan Kyler, University of Michigan. I found him in his office. I later learned that was probably the only time he had ever been there in at least 8 months. So that's a great tendril. And I said, I understand Sanskrit is really difficult, one of the more difficult languages is this possible? And he kind of very cavalierly, well, have you ever studied any language? And I said, well, a little Spanish. That doesn't go very far. Russian, I did Russian in high school. Oh, Russian. Sanskrit's easier than Russian. No problem. I said, well, why does everybody say Sanskrit is so difficult? And he said, this is simply a proposition put forward by Sanskritists to make them feel important. It's just an ego trip for Sanskritists. Well, that hooked me. I thought, okay, that's kind of cool. Of course, he lied. Sanskrit is much more difficult than Russian, and certainly Spanish. But I loved it. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and he was a very difficult teacher, but I made it through, and I became a good friend with him, too, afterwards. And just jumping ahead, I then became a Buddhist, a student of Trungpa Rinpoche, and was then interested in Tibetan. Well, no one taught Tibetan at the Michigan, and as I understand it, I believe it is still the case. When I was in college, there were 7 colleges or universities in North America that taught Tibetan. Just the other night we were talking, maybe it's up to 12. I don't know if anybody knows, but it's still very small. I couldn't study Tibetan. There was a professor, D.R. Shackleton Bailey, a classic scholar who translated Mater Cheta from Sanskrit, who knew Tibetan, but he refused to teach. And I hear Yeshke's grammar, you'll figure it out. I figured out the alphabet. That was helpful. A couple years later, I worked with a friend in Boulder, where I had then moved to after college. We read together the first chapter of Prasanapada, Chandrakirti, in Sanskrit. This was really difficult. Just 2 of us struggling to figure out what it meant, and we didn't know the French to be able to refer to that. It was very difficult, and I went back to Ann Arbor to visit friends, and my other Sanskrit teacher, Madhav Deshpande, you're studying with now, a brilliant Sanskritist, really a Sanskritist, and he said, oh, I'd be happy to help you, but I've never read this text. He was in no way a Buddhist scholar, but he was a very, very accomplished Sanskritist. So together, we sat for about 3 or 4 hours, and it would be like me trying to read some philosophy text in English that I had never read before. My English is okay. I probably could make some sense of it, and he seemed to make a lot of sense of it. And after, I was like sweating from the exertion of trying to understand this. And I am surrounded on 3 walls with floor-to-ceiling numbers of books, all in Sanskrit, mostly on Sanskrit grammar and phonology. And it's like, why should I even try? This is like, and Madhav then, who's also tired, maybe not quite as much as me, he is like reading my mind. He said, I don't think anybody could ever master this language. Well, I kind of hung it up at that point with Sanskrit. I moved on to Tibetan. And with Trungpa Rinpoche, I had another interesting, this is embarrassing, but I can't help myself. I took refuge kind of in this time period, and we received names when you take refuge. And Trungpa Rinpoche would usually read the name in Tibetan, and then a translation into English, and then you would come up and receive a nice calligraphy that he had done of the name. So I was next in line, and he reads, Dorje Tatol, limitless Vajra. So I come up, and he did this occasionally. He wouldn't let go of the paper. So I had to kind of like pull it, you know, and that was the way that he made contact with you. You know, you had to kind of look at him like, can I have it? Or, you know. And so he, kind of looking over his glasses, whispered, I don't think anybody else could hear this. He said, "Cosmic prick." I have a long way to go to aspire to that level of translation.
Well, I thought you meant that level of prickness, you know.
That too. Well, I think I've made the cosmic prick thing okay. So as you can see, my teacher, Trung Rinpoche, this is a point that I don't think we have yet brought out this last few days. In terms of translation and transmission, he is an interesting example of someone who really embodies both because he's an accomplished Lama and he learned at least English, one other target language very well. I would say his vocabulary surpassed most of his students. His syntax, not so good a lot of the time, occasionally very good. But because he embodied both, that's a very interesting topic. And I mean, we could devote a lot of time to talking about it, but for most of us, it's not, for us to be such a person. So maybe it's not all that important to say that much about. But because, as I was saying earlier, our community never, ever even thought, practicing in Tibetan? Nobody even knew. I mean, of course they knew Tibetans practiced in Tibetan, if they thought about it, but we just did everything in English. It was just totally taken for granted. Mm. And those of us that worked with Trungpa Rinpoche to actually help him affect that, because he really was the translator for the first few years as we were beginning to develop some kind of language skills. I mean, in many ways, this was a very selfish occupation. We wanted to be able to do these practices, and learning the Tibetan was just wonderfully interesting. And, it was studying Dharma. But as Trungpa Rinpoche said, it's really important to learn the Dharma first in your vernacular, in your language, and then study Tibetan. Mm. He said, I've noticed among some of the Westerners I met, especially in India, that there's something not quite right that they don't always get because they actually learn Tibetan in order to kind of learn the Dharma at the same point. Well, we weren't doing that. So we are kind of our own experiment. Mm-hmm. And I have thought many times, I don't know, Mark Nowakowski and I were talking about this a few weeks ago. This may be really only my idea, but I've had this idea for a very long time, that the fruition of the work that we do is to actually grow siddhas and accomplished practitioners by practicing in using our translations in many different languages. And that they then, hopefully some of them will be gifted poets, musicians, able to write sadhanas and commentaries and everything else. And that, to me, would be a real fruition of our work. Mm. How many liturgies have we either practiced or translated from Tibetan that were translated from an Indian language? Mm. I mean, other than a few, like the Heart Sutra and a few other, really important canonical works, virtually everything I've ever practiced is in indigenous Tibetan literature. How long did it take the Tibetans to become realized enough to write in Tibetan? This is obviously what has to happen in English and French and German and every other language. In a sense, putting us out of business. Mm-hmm. But look what that is. That is like the fruition of the transmission really happening. So I think that's our goal, a goal. I didn't answer any of the questions,
But you did
but I could.
very well. Thank you.
Okay.
Could I ask you directly on this? I think for this transmission, what still the it is still up in the air somehow, but it needs obviously translators to and I think we won't go out of business. There's a few generations ahead.
Yeah.
But so it needs what we are doing. Then it needs the practitioners, hopefully the siddhas, and it needs the teachers, of course, the Western teachers. And there are, as Richard said, already fully qualified ones, even who don't know any Tibetan, but who have been empowered. But my question would be, are there enough infrastructures to create these teachers, Western teachers? Or are these products by chance that come out of the 3-year retreats or have studied at Western universities? There doesn't seem to be any planned, from our side, any planned infrastructure that should create some kind of standard that will allow teachers to flourish and to help next generations of practitioners.
Well, I think we're so much on the cusp, as Alex said, that maybe now's the time to talk about that. I don't know if up until now there's really been enough of a context to come to any really sensible, workable model that's going to last. And the other thing too is a lot depends upon the kind of, from my perspective anyway, a lot of the sense of entrustment that there is from the tradition that we're receiving from the Tibetan side, that the model we're developing as Westerners isn't just something we're cooking up with our best ideas, but something that they can go with as well. You know, there's a sense of entrustment there too, that the model that passes, this is what I was trying to get at earlier, that the model that goes on is not just something we sort of sit down and say, okay, now we're Westerners, what do we need? That's one thing. But there's also the idea of maintaining, you know, guarding against the oops factor by maintaining that sense of continuity, because there's a sense of trust from the other side too.
I think also our experience, I mean, my experience as a student of Trungpa Rinpoche, and also, interestingly enough, when we first began studying with Khenpo Tsultrim Gyaltsen Rinpoche, when he first came to America back in the mid-80s, Trungpa Rinpoche, from the beginning, encouraged his students to be junior teachers, discussion group leaders, you know, to represent what he had presented. They weren't translators at all. They were just anybody. And some people maybe took to it better than others, but virtually everybody was encouraged to be some kind of, you know, very junior and humble, not the big deal kind of teacher. And interestingly enough, Khenpo Tsultrim, who kind of got wind of that, when we encountered him, and there were like about 8 or 9 of us translators who went down to southern Colorado to work with him. He taught 4 times a day, 2 to just the translators and 2 times to the other assembled people, an additional 5 other human beings. It's just this tiny group of people. And at the beginning of all the talks for the other people, one of the translators had to summarize what Khenpo taught in his bedroom 2 hours earlier. He sat next to you. The only good thing was we thought he didn't understand a word. And he probably didn't understand much, but it was still pretty scary to sit next to him and have to talk. Mm-hmm. But I think this is a work in progress, and should be, with all of us, not just translators, but, you know, I didn't get to do anything in answering my question, I'm sorry, but there's no question we have to be teachers, and we are teachers. And hopefully we are doing our best to represent what our lamas have taught us, but we have to help the target audience, who are native speakers of our language, to understand what he or she just said. We write practice manuals. We teach them how to do the rituals if it's a practice text. There's no question we have to serve in those roles. And if I may just mention the other question, what are the dangers we face? Very simple, 3 little letters, EGO. And this is one of my favorite quotes about ego from Trungpa Rinpoche. He said, "Ego is the pervasive confusion of appropriating energy in a self-centered way. So that would be good not to do. If we can not do that, try to be bodhisattvas, and what's at stake is everything. I mean, everything is at stake. And yet, I know how many mistakes that I've made and my colleagues, and I also know it's going to come out in the wash as time goes on. We will help each other, and hopefully the other lamas, especially the bilingual lamas, you know, I mean, the role of the bilingual lama, super important.
Thank you very much. I would like to move on to Alex now. We prepared also two questions. One would be, the first one, apart from translated texts, what tools can we provide the reader with to facilitate the transmission of knowledge? That would be the first. And the second, when English becomes the source language, issues related to the translation of Buddhist texts from English to other target languages, which certainly Alex is most qualified to talk about.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you also for all the organizers and the wonderful work that's gone into this conference. Before I address these two questions, I'd like to just add something that perhaps can be a little bit of food for thought in terms of the it that is being involved in this whole transmission process, particularly in terms of lung. And I would suggest thinking in terms of tamsik. Tamsik can be translated in many ways, a close bond, a connection. I think Ringo Rinpoche was referring to that in terms of a relation between the teacher and the student, and both of them with the text. And it relates also in empowerments, where you also have tamsik. And and commitment, and these type of issues are involved. Because what's very interesting is to go back into Sanskrit and how you have at the beginning of many texts, evam mayam shrutam, ekosmin samayam. So, thus have I heard. That certainly implies lung, doesn't it? And so it goes way, way back. And then in this samayam, it's the same word, tamsik, at this occasion. So what type of occasion? We translate it as occasion, but that word is also tamsik. So Buddha was establishing a tamsik in terms of the transmission of that text, and thus have I heard. So I think this is an interesting point to contemplate. Anyway, going to going to the topics. I feel it's very important that we create tools not just for our own use, but that we be user-oriented. And the older that I get, the more I take very seriously the initial scope of Lam Rim and think in terms of my future lives. And if I'm fortunate enough to be a human being again, what sort of tools would I want to be able to access the Dharma again? And I think that's a very good way of looking at it, since for all sentient beings doesn't really mean very much if we examine ourselves carefully. So, but hey, I want this when I'm reborn. And so the biggest problem that I think that people face, readers face, is that we're never going to agree on translation terms, all of us. I mean, we have too much EGO. And so because of that, we have this vast array of ways of translating terms. And this is the most difficult because you read one book and you can't put it together with what you read in another text. And one of the tools that I think is very, very important to develop, and this is something that I hope to be able to develop, but it needs your cooperation, which is glossaries. If you can make glossaries of your translations, be consistent in the way that you translate, and give the Tibetan, then it's very easy, technically, to make something like Google Translate, in which you have two fields you can toggle. You say, here is a term in Berzin's terminology. I want to know what it is in Hopkins. And you just click and you get it. And it works through the Tibetan. Easy to do. You can do that with text, like in the 84,000, you know. I'm reading this text and I come across this term and now I want to read another text, and you have that. Also, as I said, interactive is the way to go in the future. So if you have a translation and it's in your own terminology, and you would like to make it into Hopkins terminology, well, you can make that transformation. You just click, and it can be done technically. That's not that difficult. To then take the major technical terms and put it interactively into something that you're more familiar with. And although it sounds funny, it would be very, very helpful for many, many readers. So this interactive thing, I think, is important. Now, in terms of, but it requires people actually making these glossaries so that then it can all be put together in some giant database and accessible. Now, in terms of English, I should point out that there are an awful lot of other people in the world who don't speak English. And even if they do know English, they don't know it terribly well, and they prefer to read in their own language. My own website, I have 21 languages, and 77% of the visits to the website are people reading in non-English languages. That's a lot. That's the majority, the vast majority. The largest amount is Spanish, then comes Russian. After that, German, then Portuguese for Brazil. There's a huge audience in Brazil. And surprisingly enough, the fifth is Indonesian. And so there are plenty of people out there, and we need these materials to be accessible to them in these other languages. And it's very helpful when they have both English and their target language together so that they can compare and help themselves. So there are various things to watch out for. Just as when translating from Tibetan and Sanskrit, we need to avoid over-literal translationese. The same thing is very true in these other languages. Very often translators from English tend to try to reproduce English syntax, structure, and so on, and it comes out quite awful in their language. So this has to, you have to pay attention to that as the overseer of the translations of your material. And I think it's very important, if you have the language skills, to be able to oversee and see at least some samples of what they're doing. Also, just as Tibetan can't replicate all the verb tenses in Sanskrit, and so when there is a Sanskrit original and you're working from Tibetan, your translation really doesn't make it in terms of verb tenses if you don't go back to the original Sanskrit and see what exactly is going on in the grammar. Also, if you examine, you find that very often the Tibetan translators, I mean, it's marvelous what they did, but nevertheless, they confuse the ablative and dative cases in Sanskrit, and so again, you get different meanings and connotations. So a similar thing happens when you go from English to other languages. You have completely different verb structures in some other languages, like Arabic, completely different type of language, and you also have to deal with that. There are also many cases in which we make up a noun. I mean, English is flexible. You can make up words, but try to tell a French person or a German person to make up a word, no way. And so they will say, well, you can't make a noun out of that, or whatever. And so you have to work with them. And it is our duty as the translator from Tibetan or whatever to work with the translators of our material, because we can't expect that every language group in the world is going to develop Tibetan scholars who are able to go from Tibetan. Then I think one of the most important and difficult problems is our words this, that, it, and they. In English, you can get away with being very vague, and we can explain things very vaguely. And you don't really get the references of these things in Tibetan. But if you look at most European languages, they all have gender. And you cannot just say it or this or that. They ask you, well, what is it referring back to? Because I have to put it in the gender of what it's referring back to. And so that really means that we can't get away with not understanding the text and not understanding what the thises and the that's refer to. And you can get a clue if you can go back to the Sanskrit original, because at least there you get the genders of the thises and the that's. And God forbid it is, which then in some languages comes out there is, and that's a completely different meaning from it is, when it is supposed to refer to something else. So you have to be sensitive to these types of issues in each of the languages that your text is going to go into. Also, in some languages, they find it bad style to repeat any words in the same paragraph. But this is a problem then when it comes to key terms, because key terms, although lesser type of terms, adjectives, and so on, okay, for stylistic reasons, you can use various synonyms. But when it's a very key term, you want to stick to that same term because it's being discussed, particularly in philosophical texts. And so you really have to be a bully with your translators when they say, well, that's bad style in, this language or whatever language. I mean, there are many languages that say that's very bad style, and you have to bully them to say that the importance of the meaning overrides your stylistic concerns. Also, it's very important to have consistency of translation of your key terms and to avoid terms that have fixed connotations in another religion or philosophical system, especially in Islam. I deal with 6 Islamic languages: Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Urdu, West Punjabi, and Indonesian. And God forbid you use, I'm sorry I even used that word. Allah forbid that you use Rahman or Rahim, which are only qualities of Allah the Merciful, Allah the Compassionate. There's no way that you can use those words for compassion in Buddhism. You would get a fatwa against you immediately. And so you have to be very, very sensitive to not using any of these words that are specific to Allah, for example. And I think this is very similar when you're dealing with words that have Christian connotations. I just received an email yesterday from one of my Polish translators, and they were saying that you can't say humble or humility in Polish because it has the connotation of being humble before God and begging forgiveness for your weaknesses and transgressions of God. And so humble is not the word. Can we use modesty instead of humility? And of course you have to say yes. And so these are issues that you need to make your translators aware of, that please don't use these terms that are going to give completely different connotations to your readers. And it's something which I feel very strongly that we need to do with our own translations and avoid these heavy words like sin and guilt and so on, because that just introduces a whole nother mindset which really messes up your students. Also, a horrible problem is consistency of spelling in transliterating proper names, particularly in Asian languages. I have learned that there's hardly any Asian culture that has the concept of consistency. Just Mindu doesn't exist. And so, including our Tibetan friends. So the way that they will spell, Germany or France or any Western name will vary, anywhere. And you get into some of these other languages and they can transliterate Buddha in Urdu, for example. I've seen it 3 different ways in one paragraph, that my translators do. So you have to try to push them, and in many cases do the copy editing yourself, because they just don't believe in it, to make a consistency of spelling. And that produces then another issue, which I had to face, and which many of you may face in the future, is that there is no way, no system yet to transliterate names, particularly Tibetan and Chinese, in Arabic script languages and in many other script languages. So I had to invent that. and then to get people to actually use that. So you need to know these various languages, at least to a certain extent. What are their various letters? What are the phonetics in their language? How would you do that so that you can come up with a system in which people can actually decently pronounce the names? So then you get into the perversion of pinyin in Chinese, in which you have X's and Q's and so on, and then they reproduce X and Q in an Arabic script, and wow, is that really way off the way that the thing is actually pronounced. So you need to be sensitive to that as well, which then raises another issue, which is what do you do for if you're going to give the Tibetan terms in any of these languages? What system are you going to use to write Tibetan words? What systems are you going to use for writing Sanskrit terms? So, for instance, in Russian, they do use the Cyrillic alphabet for Sanskrit, but they use Wylie for Tibetan. So, again, what are you going to do in Chinese? Well, you're going to have to put Wylie. What are you going to have to do in Vietnamese? They use Wylie. In Vietnamese, again, what they do is, thank goodness, they don't try to transform names like we do in Chinese into Chinese characters, but they actually just put the English. So this is very good. But even in dealing with Chinese, you have the problem, which is that for many popular names, more popular names, they will write it in Chinese differently on the mainland from the way that they do in Taiwan. And we're not just talking about the issue of traditional characters versus simplified characters, just different characters. And so, again, what do you choose? So these are all issues that are very, very difficult. Let me just mention two more things. Complex sentence structure, difficult to translate. So try to make it a little bit more simple. Avoid colloquialisms, as impossible to translate into other languages. And a very last point, if your text is going to be translated into many other languages, keep a database, which is what we do, of all the questions that the different translators ask and your answers to those questions, and have that database available to any of the new translators into a new language so that you don't have to answer the same questions over and over again, and it will help them in preparing their translations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think since we only have 15 minutes left, I would like to open the floor. If you have comments, questions, please.
Well, I was expecting to get to the end of the line. I guess maybe predominantly for Karl, maybe a little bit less to Willa, a more sort of philosophical question about this issue of translation and transmission. And perhaps because I tend to work with novice students, people who are coming fresh to the field, I tend to try to relate back to my own experiences when I first encountered this material. And to a large extent, when I first encountered Buddhist material, the impression I got was that it was not written for me, that I was not the target audience of the books that I was looking at.
That's true.
Right. and so by the same token, however, right, I think that I had somewhat of a mistaken attitude in that I was expecting to be spoon-fed material, that it was the obligation of the author, the translator, to go to great lengths to make this material accessible to me without any effort on my part. And I've heard a lot of that said about what do we need to do to make this material available. And I think that's, on one level, doing a bit of a disservice, because I think making the material a little bit inaccessible is, on one level, serving a pedagogical function, forcing the student to have to take the initiative to essentially become a suitable vessel, if you wish, but the sort of person that the text was intended for. And when I started getting into more and more into the material, what led me to try to become a translator, or at least learn the languages, was because I could see in the material that I was reading that clearly the experience of working with the text had a profound effect on the translator. And that in one sense I felt that I was being robbed of that experience by the translator. Right? Seriously, that if we talk about what's being transmitted, right, and we think about the intention of the author, right, assuming that the author was actually there to do something more than demonstrate their own intelligence or, you know, or hear the sound of their own voice, but was actually trying to benefit a reader, that if the point of the text is to take the reader from some particular state to another state, that is, that there's a transformative function to the text, right? To what extent are we doing a disservice in not allowing that transformative process to take place? That is, by forcing the reader to engage, to ask questions, to not understand what's being said, and have to rise to the occasion of internalizing that.
Well, one thing is, in terms of making the text too accessible, I don't really think we have to worry about that, because the text, no matter how much introduction you write, it will still be hard work a lot of times, especially philosophical text, right? I mean, I don't think that's a problem. But I think it's about bridging the gap to some extent. It's never going to be fully, but if the gap is too big between people thinking, well, you know, no way, I'm never going to get this, then they will not even try. But if you build a little kind of staircase so that at least you get a little peak, then they might be actually inspired to go deeper. And so that's, I think that's what I think, is the point. We should maybe try to do that. It still will be hard work, and it's very clear, and one also should make that clear. And that's also the point where most people then drop out. Once they realize that very point that you were realizing, that actually you have to do a lot of your own work in Buddhism, then that's when a lot of people quit.
I think this has a lot to do also with the context of learning, where in the Tibetan community that would be the Tsadras, where you would have the teacher. But in our context, it's often at home. You're alone with your book. So, of course, that has to be taken to consideration.
Well, also, philosophical texts are written to be meditated upon. They're certainly not intended that anybody is going to read it and say, yes, I've got it, and now I'm an Arya, and so on. So I think that all that we can do is to try to provide the material, the working materials, for somebody to be able to then, I mean, you can debate if you're at a Tsadra or just by yourself, to then use analytical meditation and try to put it together, figure it out.
Maybe we can move to another question.
Well, just the one comment I was going to say is, does that mean what it means to be transparent, right? To allow that.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, state that. This text is for, it's supposed to be tough. It is tough. You're supposed to meditate on it and try to figure it out.
Okay.
Develop zunju, perseverance, patience.
Is this one working? Good.
Yeah.
Alexander, you spoke to an important point when you mentioned the need for consistency and in sort of the lexicon we develop as translators. But one thing I've become quite aware of in recent years is the extent to which Tibetans provided multiple translations of single Sanskrit terms according to context. And I've found that particularly with terms for cognition. Probably the best known example is jnana, which according to context can be translated as shepa, kimpa, yeshe, and even namshe sometimes. And some, later Tibetan authors even commented on the reasons behind that. The point being that the term jnana throughout its long conceptual history had taken on so many diverse and even divergent meanings that there's a need to be quite specific in Tibetan translations. Both Mikyo Dorje and Tsugla Drengwa made this point that the early Tibetan translators found it necessary when encountering the term jnana in the sense of ordinary dualistic knowledge to use shepa or even namshe, whereas when it referred to the awareness of an enlightened being, an Arya, or a Buddha, then they would use Khyampa or Yeshe. So I just wondered if there's anything we as translators can learn from that example. I found one, real strength in sort of the Tibetan methods of translation was to consider context extremely important for deciding on the variable sort of meanings of these terms that had taken on so many different meanings.
Right. Well, I think that we can learn a lot from the Mongolian translations of Tibetan because they face the same type of problems as we are. And Janki Rilpa Dorje's introduction to the Mongolian translations of the Kangyur wrote about that. And he said that sometimes you're going to have one Tibetan term that will need to be translated with various different Mongolian terms, and sometimes many different Tibetan terms will be translated by one Mongolian term. So we have the same type of issue. But I think that if we use one translation for one meaning and be consistent with that, then this would help very much, and especially if one could develop this sort of Google Translate type of tool. Then if you're putting it into in your English, or if you do German or whatever, but if you put it in English, you're using the English of one specific meaning. And this will become a little bit tricky if you're going to link it to other people's usages of it with that term, like Jnana or Yeshe or whatever you're going to do. But if you're going from one text to another version of another specific text, then it might be solvable. Might not. It might not work. You have to do user testing. Try it out. Beta versions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is another question for Alex. I'm a fly on the wall here because I am just starting as a translator, but my background and my day job is digital strategy. So I think about what you're doing all the time. And my question is about collaborative translation and preservation of lineages, because I'm all for digital tools for translation. It's how I'm learning. But at the same time, when you have let's say a Wikipedia approach to translation, how do you preserve, for lack of a better word, the blessings of a lineage, the actual meaning, the it that we've been referring to all day? And is this something that would be open to everyone? Or is it something that you would have to then vet the people who have access to this collaborative translation project?
Well, I don't think the Wikipedia approach would work for the actual translation from Tibetan and so on, because you would need to have knowledge of Tibetan, obviously, in order to participate in that. And I don't think that would be so cool. What I was thinking more of was in terms of versification. Here's my translation, and it reads terribly. And can people give suggestions? And not that it goes online or something like that, but maybe just you as the translator privately get this type of thing. So you get people to interactively participate in trying to make it nicer sounding. And then you're the editor. You choose.
Thank you.
And then also get user feedback. User feedback is very important. You can do their analytics. You can use that.
Thank you.
Hi. First of all, thank you all for your words. They were very meaningful to me. I have a question regarding many things that you've touched on, verse and poetry. Yesterday we talked a little bit about the translator as kind of an artist and talking about poetry. And I think that a lot of us, myself included, have a hesitancy in using verse because it's so difficult. And several people have mentioned how you lose so much meaning. And I wonder specifically in the context of practice, thinking about the concept of meaning as experience, if you also can sometimes gain something through having it in verse and being able to use a melody to do the practice in maybe a group setting, where the melody and that combined experience brings a power and brings an experience of the meaning that maybe you missed some of the words, but maybe there's some kind of meaning coming through.
I'd love to talk to that. So our community right now is in the process of versifying many of the texts that we do as a community. And part of the justification for that is that there's just a totally different experience among, polling people, doing it in a way that it's literal versus doing it in a way that has the melody and the reported experiences from people in the room when we tried different ways is that there is something lost when we let go of rhythm and melody. And I really think that ties into this notion that there is an embodied element of transmission that goes on when we practice in a group, where some kind of meaning is coming into our bodies and into our experience that can't get in through just the literal meanings alone. So I just wanted to say that if you are in that sort of community, you might try those experiments and see.
Also, what's very helpful is to have two versions. Very early versions of things like Lama Choba or 37 Bodhisattva practices, etc. I wrote, or with Lama Choba, it was with a class that I taught that we made together, a more poetical version, which was a little bit more free. And people really liked it, and they were using it for their practice. But then I looked and I said, well, this isn't terribly accurate. And so on the, then I did another translation, a more accurate one, and I put both of them on the website. And people can still prefer the more poetical one because it reads nicer, but they can look also at the more accurate one to get to fill in some of the meaning that might have been lost.
This is also the topic of workshop number 2 in 30 minutes. So come along. It's a big topic, really important.
Maybe 2 last questions.
Should be quick. First, as a translator, also as a writer and editor, I don't have the words to thank all of you, from Tsadra to the speakers to all the participants. So first, thank you for that in whatever way one can express it. Now, following Dr. Berzin's comments in particular about Google and looking up vocabulary terminology, this question is actually for everyone. I know one of the software engineers at Google who works specifically on the translation tool. So I asked him, why don't you have Tibetan? And his answer was, no data. Do we want him to have it? So we might want to discuss this probably over a period of time collectively and then get back to me and we can let him know whether we want to have it or not. So the question at issue is, well, we know the Google translation tool, if you throw in a few lines, it comes out horrible. I work in Silicon Valley doing a lot of tech docs to make my bread and butter, and one of them was managing a translation project which they resorted in the end to machine translation for, and at first I tried it out and I looked at some samples and they were terrible. Interestingly, the larger the content, the greater the content, the better the translation, because then it started to provide context to the machine. So this is what I'm just going to throw out.
I think this is being done actually already. There's a friend now sitting at the back from Isukia, and they are collecting a lot of data to do that actually eventually. But it needs a lot of effort, and I think it would have been very good to hear from him directly, because he's doing a lot of work which I think many people in the translation community are not aware of. So there's a website, and you can of course all go talk to him. I think he will be very busy today. Can you raise your hand? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Please, last question.
I'll try to make this quick. I'm just going to go back to the title of this plenary session, which is "What is our role in transmission?" And I've been thinking about this. I'm primarily an oral interpreter, and one time the Lama that I principally translate for was sort of joking with me, and he said that there are sort of 3 traditional ways that transmission occurs. One is that the teacher is present and the pupil is present. The second is that the teacher is not present but the pupil is present. And the third is that the teacher is present but the pupil is not present. And then he said, and we should add a fourth, which is that the teacher is present and the pupil is present, but the transmission does not occur. And that pertains to translators. Yeah.
Thank you.
That there's somehow this idea that because we are so much an intimate part of the action of the transmission, that we're a part of the transmission occurring, but at the same time we're apart from the actual reception of the transmission because we're in a sense acting as a part of that occurrence. So I was just curious what you had to say about that.
I think that applies much more to oral translation than written translation, because in the oral translation you don't give footnotes and sidebar explanations, pop-up thing, menus and stuff. That might happen soon, I'm sure, but usually it's just you try to get the job done as smoothly as possible, and so there's not. So it's more like a electrical wire, I think, the role of the translator. But in written translation, as we discussed, I think the translator becomes often more visible and becomes actually part of the transition and not just a conduit.
I found doing oral translation that basically why I got into that was that I felt that the teachings that I was receiving were so fantastic that I have to try to make them available to other people, and I didn't feel that the translators that I was working, that I received it from, were doing justice to these fantastic masters. But while translating, like let's say for Serkan Rinpoche, he was very strict because he was training me to do some translation for His Holiness, and he said, as a translator, never move your hands. Always have your hands down. You know, go like this and that, because then you draw attention to yourself, and be invisible. What he told me was, don't look up to His Holiness. Don't look up to the teacher. Keep your head down. Be very humble, which is very difficult because you need the body language as well. But during that actual process, don't add anything. Don't leave anything. If the teacher says shit, you say shit. This type of thing. So in that context, you're invisible.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think we're done here for this afternoon.